This is Jack Stanley, and this is part 2 in this talk about the 5000 series. Now, I have gone into detail in previous recordings about the 5000 series, what it was about. I went through a little bit of the history leading into, like, the gramophone and typewriter, and that silly Lampert typewriter. William Barry Owens, who was in charge of he was manager of the gramophone and typewriter company in London. They had been at 21 Maiden Lane. However, they decided to move out of their digs, and there was some reasons for this. Now, just to explain, starting in 1899, they started making operatic recordings. They weren't very good. They were using the Berliner system of recording. And it wasn't until Johnson's wax recording process became available in mid 1900 for the G&T, or excuse me, at that time just the gramophone company, that things changed drastically. There were good points and bad points of it. You know, when you had recorded with the Berliner system, you could play the record right back because it was on the zinc, and you could play the zinc record. But when you recorded on wax, you had to, one, gold sputter it and go through the whole process of making a disc, or you could play it, but by playing it, you would destroy it. So, it was a problem in that regard, but it was a vast improvement in the sound. And, you know, there was so many recording engineers, some really great ones working there, some really good people involved in negotiations. And, of course, they had Landon Ronald, which was a phenomenal find, the pianist. He was incredible, and he was the gateway to all of the great performers, because he accompanied them quite often, and he knew them socially. So when he was and agreed to becoming part of the gramophone, it was one of the greatest coups. Now, through his efforts and through much negotiation, they were able to record an awful lot of people. Now, Ranald did not always play piano, but, you know, just to take a look at this, let's just go up to the year 1903. Okay? Just take the year 1903 as a for instance. You know, they had recorded in Italy. You know, some of these interesting, very early recordings. You know, they had recorded in France. This is a French label. And they had recorded in India. What else? Recorded in Russia. These are very early. These are all 1901 going into 1902. This is a 1901 recording of, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce the name, Renaud, the baritone. This is one of his recordings. And that was recorded in France in 1901. By 1902, you know, think about it. They had recorded. They had recorded Caruso. And they had even recorded the amazing Calvé. She was a major star. Here she's doing the Habanera. And, you know, anyone looking outside the window at the gramophone and typewriter company would say, wow, this company's doing some incredible stuff. And when you think what's going on at Victor or Columbia at this time, let's say 1901 going into 1902, you had that mixture of coon songs. You had popular ditties of the day, someone singing songs from musicals, piccolo, cornet solos. Nothing of great merit, but very popular and profitable for the time. Emilio de Gagorza, as I mentioned before, Senor Francisco, that's one of the names he used. You know, there were lots of other folks who were doing operatic recording. Secondary tier, one might say. The great names had made some Bettini recordings, and somewhat as a lark, more so than actually sitting there leaving their art for posterity. But to see what G&T was doing, it really was incredible, and of course you can understand why Eldridge Johnson wanted to be a part of that. So he put Calvin Child in charge of that. You know, one of the things that's very interesting that comes out of all of this, if I may just move things around here, is that they worked out deals with all these various singers. And it wasn't easy to get them at times. You know, there's nothing quite like opera singers, especially at that time. They were so important, they were so fussy, they were not easy to deal with. You know, people kind of relegated the name prima donna with bitch. One has to think of Nellie Melba, perhaps, and how they would treat each other wasn't too nice either, you know. What's that lovely story about Nellie Melba walking by a hotel in which Tetrazzini was at, and Tetrazzini was rehearsing? And she went to the manager of the hotel and says, "Do you allow cats?" You know, that kind of thing. That was Melba, that was Tetrazzini. But these people were not the easiest to deal with. You know, that recording that they did with, the series of recordings that they did in Milan with Caruso, he wasn't easy enough go in person, but he was in a hurry. And so they did a more or less production line recording setup. They made 10 records in nothing flat. Now the problem was they were in a hurry and they got sloppy, and maybe time just didn't permit. There was some major errors on some of the records, which would be straightened out in some cases, and in other cases just replaced with recordings that would be made later in 1903 and then in 1904 in New York for the Victor Talking Machine Company. In fact, from that point on, every record made by Caruso was in the Victor Talking Machine Company. But early on, the earliest recordings were with G&T, and also there was a stint with a small Italian company, IRCC or something like that. That's not the correct name. It's a cylinder company in Italy. They made, I think, 3 or 4 recordings, and then he made some recordings for Zonophone, which were in many respects better performed than some of his G&T ones. Nonetheless, all these stories, it leads to perhaps the one of the funniest stories of all. And I have to tell this to you so you understand what these people were like. Emma Calvé. She was a phenomenal singer, performer. And with each of these artists, they would present them with a good-sized check to make recordings. And they were working their way up. They had recorded Caruso by this point. They had recorded a number of individuals, and by mid-1902, they finally got Calvé to agree. After going through all of her terms and setting everything up for her entourage, The carriage was sent, containing, I believe, Owens and Langdon Ronald, who was their pianist, to calm her fears as they rode to Maiden Lane, which was not the prettiest part of London, let's just put it that way. They got to the recording studio, and Calvé looked at the building and said, "This is a tavern. There are thieves, there are bandits. You brought me here to be robbed." And she went into operatic hysterics. Now, of course, Barry Owens looking at Ronald like, "Do something." And Ronald came up with an idea. It's kind of interesting how this worked. He saw how she was acting and saw he couldn't pacify her. So he said he ran into the office. He said, "I never ran faster upstairs." And he said there was a new employee who was very, very good looking. And he said he grabbed this guy and he said he handed her the check and said, "Give it to her." He had no idea practically what was going on. And so he said, "Be handsome, be handsome." And he ran him down the stairs and brought him over to Calvé, who was still in a fit of hysterics. And this young gentleman came to her and handed her the check, and all of a sudden she was calm and intrigued. And so this young gentleman offered her his arm, and he walked her to the recording studios. Now, the recording studios were in the basement of this kind of dreary old building, so it wasn't pretty. And so when she got down there and they started heating up the wax and setting everything up, Calvé, who was ready and had vocalized, she was all set to go, got ready for the first record. And as soon as they put it on, she started to sing with the piano. And like a few lines in, she just said, "What did you think of my..." And they said, "You can't do that." That was the end of that record. And then she would do it, and she would shriek with happiness or cry with despair. This was not easy. She also insisted on dancing while she was playing Carmen and doing the dances she would do on stage, okay? This is all going on, and you're watching, in a sense, watching everybody in that recording studio, except for Calvé, age 5 years. And so they finally got through some of the records. They started recording others, and it seemed no matter what she did, she would hit the wrong note. After a couple of tries and a couple of wrong notes, they just released it as it was, and it remained that way for years. And then finally, she was done. Finally, they got her out of there, and then they cleaned up the place, but they noticed a piece of paper lying on the floor, all crumpled up. It was her check. She had totally forgotten about it. It was a very difficult recording session, one of the more difficult. But they were preparing, they got to learn some because you had Patty coming, you had Tumano coming in the future. And of course, they were pretty interesting as well. So getting back to the story, because I have a tendency, I can sit there and babble about stuff, is that they were working there, and of course, Child selects music. Here's an important factor. If you wanted a recording of that recording session from 1902 with Calvé, you had to order it directly from the gramophone and typewriter company, and you would have this, right? That's the piece. The only way to get it. So this is why they worked out this deal. So they could trade their matrices with Victor and Victor and G&T. Now the problem was copying. Now I have talked before about this too in other videos, that the method of making these records in the early days, the first wax system, before the multiple stamper system was developed by Johnson was that you would record, gold sputter it, you'd make a mother, and from that you could make one stamper. One. Now, they discovered this unfortunate situation with the Caruso recordings. When he made his recordings, they turned out to be very, very popular. And, well, that was difficult because they had to do all kinds of crazy stuff to deal with his recordings, like what you will see, if I can compare. This is a first edition Caruso. I don't know if it's possible, if you can see, there's writing on the label. I don't know if that's visible or not. Now this is a copy that was made of another recording, but you'll notice on the side, you'll see CO right over there. And that, it's a copy. This is kind of an interesting copy because this was made in Russia. You don't see those very often. And so what they would do is they would take the stamper, and if they discovered something was a big seller, they would stamp onto wax, recording wax, the impressions of the record. And they would go through the entire process again, gold sputter it, and make another stamper, a fresh one. However, it would have the inherent flaws, and it would be sonically a little less than the original recording. So each time you made a copy, yes, you preserved the record, but you lost some of the fidelity each time. So the only way with a lot of these recordings to make them the 5000 series, the only way they could do this was to basically make stampers into wax and make copies. Some of the recordings that went into the 5000 series were fresh recordings, first editions. Some were second. Some were third. And there might even be a possibility that one or two might have been fourth generation. So, sonically, they weren't the same. And, of course, when they did these recordings in the 5000 series, which would come out in March of 1903, just a week or two before the Columbia recordings would come out. Now, Columbia's recordings, they were domestic recordings. They take the prize in coming up with the first operatic recordings made in the United States were done by Columbia, of major stars. Victor's 5000 series, which was about as successful as Columbia's operatic series, which means it wasn't successful. Everybody lost on this. The Columbia Company. Edward Easton was of the type, when he would invest in something, he would look for a quick return. And if he didn't see it, he'd just kill it. With the Victor Company, Eldridge Johnson knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to get the best artists. And when you had great artists, it was an indication that you had a great company. And the great artists whose records you probably wouldn't buy would influence you to buy the other records, which you realize must be as good as the operatic recordings. So when the 5000 series was introduced, there was a lot of fanfare about it. And, of course, perhaps the greatest singer around at that time, outside of a handful, Patti Tamagno and the like, was Emma Calvé. She was Carmen. She was the greatest Carmen. And so the first of the records for the 5000 series would indeed be Emma Calvé doing the Habanera. And that came out in March of 1903. By October of 1903, it was all over. And there was some crazy stuff that they did. I want to show you a couple of other things that I found rather interesting here. Of course, probably I didn't pull it out, did I? Okay. There was something else that was very interesting, and that was the 5000 series recordings made at the beginnings of 1903 and dying in 1903 had Red Seal records that were $2.50. Now, for some bizarre reason, they decided to market Black Label records under the same number. So imported Black Label records would be part of the 5000 series, which was set up for the imported Red Seal at a different price. Now this is one of the 5000 series Black Label records. These are ones that you never see. I always found it interesting that the Red Seal 5000 series are incredibly rare. But even more rare is the 5000 series Black Label. You don't see them at all. It was a wildly unsuccessful venture, just like the Columbia operatic recordings. However, it was a beginning. Unfortunately, Columbia could have taken the prize. Columbia could have taken the lead had they started their operatic program and let it run. However, they dropped it. Edward Easton, he just didn't stick with it. Johnson realized he wasn't going to make money initially with operatic recordings, and he stuck with it. Smart move, because eventually the greatest company in the world, circa 1920, would be indeed the Victor Talking Machine Company. And Edison, who got into opera too eventually, Edison, Columbia, G&T, all the other companies, they took somewhat of a second seat to the Victor Talking Machine Company. And it all began with that 5000 series. It all began with Calvin Child going to England to try out and try to find new and interesting recordings to market for the Victor Company. And that's about all I want to say right now. I have a lot of other stuff to talk about, and you know, it's an interesting thing. I start talking, and then I end up going in a different direction. So I want to say to you, in closing here, if you get a chance, try to find them, the 5000 series. Very rare. They were only made for a few months. However, they were the beginning of a heritage, in America at least, called the Red Seal record. And anyone who knew their music, when they heard that someone was on a Red Seal, they knew they were good. So, that's the end of this. If you have comments and thoughts, please write. And I love to share knowledge. I like to learn from you, and I hope I can teach you some stuff too. So thank you very much.